He was standing on the sidewalk across from the main entrance, and he was holding a photograph of my granddaughter. I want you to sit with that for a moment before I say another word. A stranger. On a quiet street in Burlington, Vermont, on a cold Tuesday afternoon in late October, standing perfectly still in the gray light with a printed photograph in his hands. And the face in that photograph was Abigail's face. My Abigail. 30 years old, brilliant, careful, the kind of young woman who pressed flowers between the pages of library books and remembered every conversation she had ever had with you. Her face in the hands of a man I had never seen before in my life. I did not scream. I did not run. I am 76 years old, and I have lived long enough to know that screaming rarely solves anything, and running is even less productive. What I did was stand absolutely still on that brick pathway, with the elm trees arching overhead and the smell of wood smoke and cold air mixing together the way they only do in Vermont in October, and I felt the bottom of my stomach drop away from me, the same way it had only a handful of times in my entire life. The way it had when I got the phone call about my husband. The way it had the morning I understood something was deeply wrong with my family, and I could not yet name what it was or where it had started. I had not expected any of this when I drove up from my house on Willard Street that afternoon. I had not expected any of it at all. Before I go any further, I want to stop for just a moment and say something to whoever is watching this right now. I know some of you are sitting at home with a cup of something warm. I know some of you are in your cars or lying in bed because the night got long and the quiet got loud. Wherever you are right now, I am glad you are here with me. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. What city? What state? What time of day it is where you are? I read every single one of those comments, and they mean more to me than you can possibly know. And if what I'm about to share with you today is already making something stir in your chest, go ahead and leave a like. It helps this old woman keep telling her stories. Subscribe if you have not already, because there is a brand new story here every single day without fail. Now let me go back to that sidewalk, because what happened next is something I am still not entirely sure I have found the right words for. My name is Helen Mercer. I am 76 years old, and I live in a tall, narrow house on Willard Street in Burlington, Vermont, which is a city that has always suited me more than I ever suited it, if that makes any sense at all. I am a retired estate planner. 31 years of sitting across kitchen tables and office desks from people who were trying to figure out what to do with everything they had built over the course of a lifetime. Houses, land, savings accounts. Jewelry passed down through 3 generations. Businesses that had started as dreams and become real things in the world. My job was to help people think clearly about what they owned, what they owed, and what they wanted to leave behind for the people who came after them. I was good at it. I had a reputation for patience and for precision, and I carried both of those qualities home with me every night and applied them to my own life with the same care I gave to everyone else's. My husband, Richard Mercer, passed away 11 years ago from a heart that simply decided it had done enough work. He was 68 years old, and he was in the middle of a sentence about the Red Sox when he died, which I have always thought was the most Richard way to go that there possibly was. I miss him every morning when I make coffee. I miss him on Sunday afternoons when the house gets that particular quality of quiet that only happens when there is no one else in it. I miss him in the specific way that you miss the person who knew all your stories already, because now when something happens, I have to begin every account from the very beginning and explain who everyone is. With Richard, I never had to start from the beginning. He already knew where all the threads connected. I have 2 children. My son, Thomas, who is 54 years old and lives 40 minutes south of me in Shelburne with his wife, Rebecca, and my daughter, Margaret, who moved to Portland, Oregon 15 years ago and calls me every Sunday at 9 in the morning without fail, which is the kind of consistency I have come to rely on more than she knows. Thomas and Rebecca have 1 daughter together, Abigail Claire Mercer. She came into the world 30 years ago in the middle of a March snowstorm that shut down half of Chittenden County, and she arrived with the kind of focused expression on her face that made the nurses laugh because it looked like she was already thinking through a problem she had not yet decided to share with anyone. Abigail has always been that way. Focused, interior. The kind of person who chose her words the way a jeweler chooses a setting for a stone, not carelessly, not quickly, but with a precision that made everything she said feel like it had been considered from every angle before it came out of her mouth. She is completing a postgraduate fellowship in historical preservation at the Graduate Arts Institute on Colchester Avenue. She studies old buildings, old documents, the physical record of lives that people left behind in wood and stone and ink on paper. She chose that field the same way she chose everything, with a certainty that made argument feel beside the point. She is not the kind of person who asks for help. That is the detail that matters most, and I need you to understand it before I can make you feel the weight of what happened that afternoon. Abigail does not ask for things. She manages, she plans, she solves. So when she called me 3 weeks before that Tuesday in October and asked me, specifically me and no one else, to come to the campus after her afternoon seminar, I noticed it. I set the phone down on my kitchen counter and I stood there looking at the window over the sink for what must have been 2 full minutes, thinking about the precise quality of her voice when she had asked me. Not frightened, not urgent, but deliberate in a way that felt different from her ordinary deliberateness. Like she had thought very carefully about who to call, and after considering every option, she had chosen me. I did not ask her why. If Abigail wanted me to know why, she would have told me. I said I would be there, and I was. The campus on Colchester Avenue is the kind of place that looks like it was designed to make you feel that the serious business of understanding the past is worthy of beautiful surroundings. Old brick buildings set back from the street behind iron fencing. Elm trees so large and so old, they must have been there when the buildings were built. Their roots by now as much a part of the architecture as the stone foundations. In October, the leaves were gone, and the bare branches made a complicated lacework against the pale gray sky, and the whole campus had the still, considered quality of a place that understood it was being observed and was entirely comfortable with that. I parked on a side street and walked to the main entrance, which is a set of heavy oak doors set into a brick archway with the year 1894 carved into the stone above them. The year always catches my eye. I spent 31 years thinking about what people leave behind, and a date carved into stone above a door is one of the most honest forms of record-keeping there is. It says, plainly and without apology, we were here, and we knew we would not always be here, and we wanted you to know it. The dean was waiting for me just inside the doors. His name was Arthur Hollingsworth, a tall man in his early 60s with the kind of careful posture that suggested he had spent most of his career in rooms where posture mattered. He shook my hand with both of his, which is the kind of handshake that means the person has something to say to you that they are not certain how to begin. He asked if I would come into his office for a moment before going up to find Abigail. I followed him down a hallway that smelled of old paper and steam heat, the particular smell of academic buildings that have been heated the same way for 60 years, and we sat down in his office, which had the organized density of a room where a person spends most of their waking hours. Books, files. A large window looking out onto the inner courtyard where the bare elm trees made the same complicated patterns against the sky. He was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they are choosing exactly how to say something. Then he said, "Mrs. Mercer, I want you to know that Abigail is perfectly well. She is upstairs right now, and she asked me to let you know she will be with you shortly. But she also asked me, several weeks ago, to speak with you privately if you ever came to the campus." He paused. "She told us that if anything unusual were ever to happen here, we were to contact you. Not her parents, not anyone else. You specifically." I sat very still in the chair across from his desk. "Did she say why?" I asked him. "She did not," he said. "Only that you would know what to do." I thought about that. I thought about it very carefully, The way I had spent 31 years thinking carefully about the things people said and the things they did not say, because in estate planning, as in most serious things, what is left unsaid is usually more important than what makes it into the document. Abigail had nominated me as her person of contact at her university. She had done it quietly, weeks in advance, without telling me. She had done it because she trusted me to know what to do, and she had done it in the same careful, deliberate way she did everything. I thanked the dean and stepped back out into the hallway. I walked back down toward the main doors, intending to wait in the entryway for Abigail to come down, and that is when I pushed one of the heavy oak doors open and looked across the street and saw the man standing on the sidewalk with the photograph. He was perhaps 60 years old, heavy-set, wearing a dark wool coat and a gray scarf that looked like it had been used and washed many times over many years. He was holding a printed photograph in both hands, the way a person holds something they are uncertain whether to put away or keep out, turned slightly so that the image faced the street rather than himself. He was not moving. He was simply standing, looking at the entrance of the building with the patient expression of a man who had learned somewhere along the way that patience was the most efficient strategy available to him. And the face in the photograph was Abigail's. Not a recent photograph. The image had a quality to it that suggested it had been printed from a scan rather than taken digitally. The colors were slightly flattened in the way of photographs that had been kept in a drawer or a box for a long time and then reproduced, but the face was unmistakably her. Her dark eyes, her particular way of holding her chin slightly forward when she was concentrating on something just past the frame of the image. I stood in the doorway of the building for what could not have been more than 10 seconds, though it felt considerably longer. And I looked at this man holding this photograph, and I felt the thing happen in my body that happens when a professional instinct and a grandmotherly instinct arrive at exactly the same moment and deliver exactly the same message. Something is out of place. Something is not where it is supposed to be. And if I have learned anything at all in 76 years of being alive, it is that when two separate parts of you say the same thing at the same time, you had better listen. I did not approach him directly. I turned back into the building, found a member of the campus security staff, and explained quietly and calmly what I had seen. The young man, whose name badge said Daniel, did not dismiss me. He went outside with me, and we watched the man together for a moment, and then Daniel crossed the street alone and spoke with him briefly. He came back looking not alarmed, but thoughtful, in the way of someone who has just received information that requires a moment of organization. He told me that the man had identified himself as a retired attorney named Gerald Foss from Montpellier. He said Mr. Foss had been trying for several weeks to locate the family of a woman named Eleanor Whitfield, who had been a resident of Burlington until her death some 14 years earlier, and who had entrusted to him, in his capacity as a legal professional, a collection of historical documents and personal letters, with specific instructions that they be returned to her family only when he could identify a member of that family who, in his assessment, was prepared to understand their full significance. Daniel paused, then added that Mr. Foss had been visiting the campus intermittently because Eleanor Whitfield had, at some point in her life, made a significant donation to the historical archives housed in this building, and because he had reason to believe, through his own research, that Eleanor Whitfield was connected by family history to someone currently affiliated with the campus. That someone, it appeared, was my granddaughter. I stood there in the cold October air under the bare elm trees, and I held all of this in my mind the way I had held 1,000 complicated documents over the course of my career, turning it this way and that, looking for the shape of what it meant. I did not yet know who Eleanor Whitfield was. I did not yet understand what the photograph contained beyond Abigail's face. I did not yet know what documents Gerald Foss had been carrying around with him for 14 years, waiting for the right moment to deliver. But I had spent 31 years in estate planning, and I knew, with the precision of long professional experience, that when a retired attorney has been holding a collection of documents for 14 years with instructions to return them only under specific circumstances, those documents almost always contain the answer to a question that someone has been asking for a very long time without knowing exactly who to ask. Rebecca arrived at the campus 40 minutes later. Abigail had called her apparently in the interval between the dean's conversation with me and the moment I stepped back inside to tell Abigail what I had seen on the street. Rebecca is 52 years old, and she is, professionally and personally, one of the most composed people I have ever known in my life. She is an architectural historian. She studies buildings the way I studied documents. She finds the narrative embedded in the physical record, in a roofline, a door frame, a particular style of brick coursing that places a building in a specific decade with the precision of a fingerprint. She is not a person who loses her composure in public. She is not a person who loses her composure very much at all. When she walked into the campus entrance and I showed her the photograph that Daniel had brought in from Gerald Foss at my request, a reproduction printed on plain paper, not the original, just something so she could see what it contained, Rebecca went very still in the way that she goes still when she is processing something large. And then, slowly, her face changed. The composure shifted. Her eyes went bright with tears that she blinked hard against, and I watched her press her hand to her mouth for a moment before she lowered it, drew a breath, and said in a voice that was almost entirely steady, "Helen, that is the Aldrich mantel clock." I looked at the photograph again. In the background of the image, just visible behind Abigail's left shoulder, was the corner of what appeared to be an ornate wooden mantelpiece with a clock mounted in the center. I had not noticed it before because I had been looking at Abigail's face. Rebecca had looked past the face entirely and found something else, something that to her trained eye carried an immediate and unmistakable weight. "What is the Aldrich mantel clock?" I asked her. She pressed her lips together for a moment. "It belonged to my grandmother," she said. "My mother's mother. It disappeared from the family estate in 1988, and no one ever knew what happened to it. There was a dispute. There was a legal situation that was never properly resolved. And then my grandmother died, and then my mother died, and the clock was just—" She stopped. "It was just gone. We thought it was gone." I looked at my daughter-in-law in the November light of that campus entrance hallway, at this composed, careful, brilliant woman whose eyes were full of tears she was working very hard to keep from falling. And I understood with the absolute precision of 31 years of professional experience that what we were dealing with was not a threat, not a crime, not anything that required fear. What we were dealing with was something considerably more complicated than fear and considerably older. We were dealing with an inheritance that had never properly arrived, a question that had been waiting inside a collection of documents held by a retired attorney in Montpellier for 14 years, and a family that had spent decades mourning the answer without knowing where it was kept. I put my hand on Rebecca's arm. "All right," I said. "Let us find out what Mr. Foss has been carrying around." The next morning, I called my attorney. His name is Warren Tillotson, and he has had an office on Church Street in Burlington for 33 years, which means he has been practicing law in this city for almost as long as I was planning estates in it. And the two of us have an understanding built on mutual professional respect and a shared certainty that the correct way to handle a complicated situation is slowly, carefully, and with every document in order before you do anything that cannot be undone. I told him what had happened on the campus. I told him about Gerald Foss and the documents and what Rebecca had said about the clock in the photograph. Warren listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always appreciated about him. He listened the way a doctor listens to a symptom, with the quiet attention of someone filing information away in a system that he trusts. When I finished, he said, "Helen, before you have any substantive conversation with Mr. Foss about the contents of those documents, I want you to let me reach out to him first, professionally, just to establish what we are dealing with legally before anyone says anything that could complicate a future estate claim. That is exactly what I thought, I told him. I know it is, he said. That is why you called me. I want to take a breath here for a moment, because I realize I have been carrying you along quite quickly, and there is something important I want to say. If you are sitting with me through all of this, through the careful details and the slow unfolding of a story that is really about what families leave behind and what families find again, I want you to know that I see you there. I want to know where you are. Tell me in the comments what city or state you are watching from. Tell me what time of day it is where you are right now. If this story is reaching something in you, something about family and inheritance and the quiet weight of things left unresolved for too long, please leave a like. It helps this story find the people who need to hear it. Subscribe if you want another story tomorrow, because there is one here every single day. And now let me go back to Burlington, Vermont, in the autumn of last year, because what Warren found out when he called Gerald Foss is where this story truly begins. But before I get there, I need to tell you who I am, not just what I did, because I think the who matters here in ways that will make everything that follows clearer. I grew up in Barra, Vermont, which is a small city about 45 miles southeast of Burlington, known for two things in roughly equal measure: the granite quarries that drew Italian and Scottish immigrant workers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and a quiet, stubborn independence that comes from spending most of the year in cold weather and learning to rely on your own resources because waiting for someone else to solve your problem was a luxury the weather did not always permit. My father worked for a surveying company. My mother was a bookkeeper for a lumber yard. We were not a family with money in any meaningful sense, but we were a family with systems, with organization, with a belief that the correct response to uncertainty was documentation. Write it down. Keep a record. Know what you own and what you owe and what the difference is between them. My mother kept a ledger, an actual handwritten ledger in a green cloth cover where she recorded every household expense and every income payment for 30 years. I found it after she passed, and I sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours reading through it, through the careful entries in her handwriting, and I thought about all of the people I had sat across from in my professional life who had no such record, who came to me with shoeboxes of receipts and contradictory memories and family stories that 3 different relatives told 3 different ways. And I understood for the first time why documentation had always felt to me not like a bureaucratic chore, but like an act of love. My mother had kept that ledger so that we would know, so that we would understand what our life had cost and what it had produced and where the resources had come from and where they had gone. She had written it all down so that none of it would disappear. I went into estate planning because I wanted to do for other families what no one had done for mine when my own parents passed. I wanted to make sure that what people built over the course of their lives did not get lost in the gap between dying and being understood. I worked for 31 years. I sat with widows and widowers and adult children and estranged siblings and occasionally with people who had discovered that a family member had left something behind that no one had known existed. Those were the cases I found most interesting and most heartbreaking in roughly equal measure because they were always about the same thing underneath the legal complexity. They were about the failure of communication between people who had loved each other and had somehow never managed to say clearly what needed to be said before time ran out. I met Richard Mercer when I was 29 years old at a conference in Stowe. He was a civil engineer who spent his professional life thinking about what the land beneath a building could actually support, which is, I have always thought, a perfect complement to someone who spent her life thinking about what documents and agreements could actually carry. We were married for 45 years. We raised Thomas and Margaret in a house on Willard Street that we bought when Thomas was 2 years old, and Margaret was not yet born. That house is still where I live. I have had no desire to leave it. Richard is still there in a way that has nothing to do with sentimentality and everything to do with the fact that 45 years of a life does not simply evaporate from the walls of a place when the person who lived it is gone. Thomas is a quiet man, careful and methodical in the way of someone who watched his father look at land and his mother look at documents and absorbed from both of them a deep preference for precision over impression. He manages a regional bank in Shelburne. He is good at his work. He is, I will say honestly, not always good at the more complicated emotional mathematics of family life. And this is not a criticism. It is an observation earned over 54 years of watching him navigate the world. He loves his wife and his daughter with a depth that does not always find its way to the surface, and this has occasionally caused complications that patience and time have had to resolve rather than conversation. Rebecca came into our family 26 years ago, and I will tell you plainly that she is one of the finest people I have ever known. She brought a particular kind of intelligence into our family, the kind that is at home in archives and reading rooms, that thinks in centuries rather than quarters, that understands a building or a document or a family not as a fixed thing, but as a process, a series of decisions made by people who were doing their best with what they had and what they knew at the time. Her own family is complicated in ways that I learned gradually, over the 26 years of knowing her, rather than all at once. Her mother, Patricia, passed away 16 years ago. Her grandmother, whom she called Gran Ellie, passed away 2 years before that. There were, she had mentioned to me once or twice over the years, legal questions surrounding the estate that had never been properly resolved. A dispute about property, documents that could not be located, a clock, apparently, that had disappeared. She had mentioned it in the way that people mention old wounds that have healed over imperfectly. Not bitterly, but with a specific flatness in her voice that told me the flatness was deliberate, that she had chosen not to feel it fully because feeling it fully had not produced any useful result. Warren called me 3 days after I asked him to reach out to Gerald Foss. He called in the early morning, which is when he calls when he has something he considers significant, because Warren Tillotson does not believe in wasting the morning hours on anything that can wait until afternoon. "Helen," he said, "I have spoken with Mr. Foss at some length. He is legitimate. I verified his bar registration in Vermont, which lapsed when he retired 8 years ago but was active for 32 years prior. He was a sole practitioner in Montpelier, specializing in estate and probate work." "All right," I said. "The documents he has been holding," Warren continued, "were entrusted to him in the spring of 2010 by a client named Eleanor Whitfield, who was at that time in the early stages of a cognitive decline. She passed away in the autumn of 2010. Mr. Foss has held the documents since her death in accordance with her instructions, which were, as he describes them, specific and somewhat unusual. He was to return the documents only when he had identified a member of the Whitfield family who was, to use his phrase, in a position to act on what the documents contained. I was quiet for a moment. "What do the documents contain, Warren?" "He would not specify in detail over the phone," Warren said, "but he indicated that they include a collection of personal correspondence, a set of handwritten journals, land records, probate filings from the 1980s, and a sealed letter that Eleanor Whitfield wrote specifically to be opened by a named family member." "What family member?" I asked. "The letter," Warren said carefully, "is addressed to Rebecca." I sat with that for a moment. Not Rebecca Mercer, my daughter-in-law. The letter had been addressed to Rebecca specifically, by a woman who had died 14 years ago, and who had known Rebecca's family through a connection I did not yet understand. But Eleanor Whitfield had thought about Rebecca, had chosen Rebecca, had left something for her specifically, held by a trusted attorney, to be delivered when the circumstances were right. "Warren," I said, "I need to know what the connection is between Eleanor Whitfield and Rebecca's family before I tell Rebecca any of this." "I thought you would say that," Warren said. "I have already pulled the public probate records from the Chittenden County Courthouse. Eleanor Whitfield was, from what I can determine so far, the sister of Rebecca's maternal grandmother." I set my coffee cup down on the counter very carefully. "She was Rebecca's great-aunt," I said. "A great-aunt that, as far as I can determine from the record, the family believed had no living connection to them by the time of her death. I looked out the kitchen window at Willard Street, at the bare maple tree on the sidewalk that Richard had planted the year Thomas started school. Now enormous and permanent, and as much a part of the street as the pavement under it. I thought about Eleanor Whitfield, sitting with a declining memory and an attorney across a desk in Montpellier, making careful arrangements for documents she understood she would not be alive to deliver herself. I thought about what it meant to be precise about something at the very end of your clarity, to say this must go to this person and no one else, and only when the time is right, and then to trust the machinery of professional obligation to carry that precision forward through the years after you were gone. Set up a meeting, I said. Gerald Foss, you, me, and Rebecca, somewhere neutral. I would like the Chittenden County Historical Archives if they will accommodate us. It seems appropriate. I will make the arrangements, Warren said. Gerald Foss came to that meeting 2 weeks later, on a Friday morning in mid-November, and he brought with him a document case of the kind that has a combination lock and a handle, and the worn look of something that has been carried back and forth many times over many years. He was a quiet man in person, quieter than I had expected from the composed way he had stood on that sidewalk. He had the deliberate manner of someone who had spent a career understanding that the wrong word at the wrong moment could unravel things that had taken years to build, and that this was a responsibility worth taking seriously. He shook hands with Warren. He shook hands with me. He looked at Rebecca for a moment before he shook her hand, with the expression of someone completing a task they have thought about for a very long time. And he said, "Mrs. Mercer, I am glad we were able to find you." Rebecca looked at him steadily. She had known for 2 weeks that this meeting was coming. I had told her, carefully and with Warren's guidance, that there were documents related to her family's estate history that had been held by a retired attorney and that appeared to have significant personal relevance. I had not told her about the sealed letter addressed to her by name. I had thought about whether to tell her and decided that some surprises are better delivered in the presence of a lawyer and a grandmother than over a telephone call on a Tuesday evening. I did not know anyone was looking, she said. I was not always certain I was looking in the right direction, he said, but I made a promise, and I kept it. We sat down at a long table in the reading room of the Chittenden County Historical Archives. The room had the specific quality of rooms built for the serious consultation of old things. High ceilings, controlled lighting, the smell of paper that has been carefully maintained for a long time, not musty but preserved, the way a well-kept archive smells different from a poorly kept one in the same way that a healthy old tree smells different from a sick one. There were 2 archivists on staff that day, both of whom had agreed to be present in their professional capacity in case any of the documents needed to be examined in context with the existing collection. Gerald Foss opened his document case with the combination and removed a collection of materials arranged in labeled folders. He explained, without preamble, that Eleanor Whitfield had come to him in 2010 in a state of clear-eyed urgency. She understood that her memory was failing. She had begun the process of organizing her affairs, and she had discovered, in the course of that organization, materials that she had kept for decades, waiting, she said, for the right moment to return them to the family. She had waited too long. The right moment had not come in the years when her mind was clear enough to manage it herself. And so she had brought everything to Gerald Foss and asked him to manage it for her. And she had told him exactly what to do with it and when. The materials in his folders included correspondence between Eleanor Whitfield and her sister, Rebecca's maternal grandmother, spanning 40 years from the 1940s through the 1980s. They included journals Eleanor had kept, intermittently, across the same period. They included a set of land records and a deed to a small property in the town of Charlotte, just south of Burlington, that appeared to have been transferred from the family estate in 1987, 1 year before Rebecca's grandmother had expected it to be transferred, and in circumstances that the correspondence suggested had been a source of significant and unresolved pain between the 2 sisters. They included probate documents from the Chittenden County Courthouse, filed in connection with the estate of their father, who had died in 1986, that contained what appeared to be a discrepancy between the original will and the final distribution of assets, and they included, in a sealed envelope with Rebecca's full name written on the outside in a handwriting that none of us recognized, a letter from Eleanor Whitfield, addressed to the granddaughter of her sister. Rebecca sat at that table in the reading room of the Chittenden County Historical Archives, and she did not touch the letter. She looked at it for a long moment, at her own name in a dead woman's handwriting on an envelope that had been sealed for at least 14 years and perhaps longer, and she was quiet in the absolute way that she was quiet when something was very large. Then she looked at me, and I nodded. Because that is what grandmothers are for. Not to manage the moment, but to be present inside it, so that whoever is going through it knows they are not alone. She reached for the envelope. If you are still with me right now, I want you to stop and take a breath with me. Because what Rebecca read in that letter is going to change everything you think you understand about this family and about the photograph and about why a retired attorney spent 14 years carrying a document case across Vermont, waiting for the right person to appear. If you have been sitting with this story and it is reaching something in you, something about family secrets and old wounds and the things that get lost between generations, tell me about it in the comments. Have you ever found something in your own family history that changed the way you understood people you thought you already knew? Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what time it is. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. There is a new story here every single day, and every one of them carries something true inside it. Now let me tell you what was in that letter. Eleanor Whitfield had written it in the spring of 2010, in the last weeks of her clear-headedness, in a hand that was still precise even as it acknowledged what was coming. She began by addressing Rebecca directly, by name, in the second person, which gave the letter an intimacy that made reading it aloud, as Warren did slowly and carefully with Rebecca's permission, feel like being in the room with someone speaking. She wrote that she had known for many years that she owed the family an explanation. She had not provided it when Rebecca's grandmother was alive because her pride had been too large and her fear too settled to allow it. She had not provided it after her grandmother's death because the grief of the loss had made the explanation feel too late to matter. And then the years had accumulated and her memory had begun to fail, and she had understood, with the particular clarity that sometimes comes at the edges of a declining mind, that if she did not arrange for the explanation now, it would die with her, and the question of the Aldrich property and the mantel clock and the will and the sisters and the 40 years of silence would go into the ground with her and never come out. The Aldrich property, she explained, was a small farmstead in Charlotte that had belonged to the family for 3 generations. It was not worth very much in monetary terms, but it had been the source of a dispute between the 2 sisters that had lasted from the death of their father in 1986 until Eleanor's own death in 2010. The dispute had begun with the will. Their father had intended, Eleanor wrote, to leave the property jointly to both sisters. But his attorney, who was old and unwell and who died himself the following year, had prepared the final document incorrectly, transferring sole ownership to Eleanor rather than joint ownership to both. Eleanor had discovered this error after the estate was settled. She had known that it was an error, and instead of coming forward and correcting it, she had said nothing. She had said nothing because she and her sister had been in the middle of a conflict about something else entirely, something smaller and older and more personal, a disagreement about the care of their mother in her final years that had left both of them raw and resentful and unwilling to extend any generosity toward the other. And because she had said nothing, her sister had believed the unequal distribution was intentional, had believed that Eleanor had maneuvered to claim sole ownership, had believed for the rest of her life that her sister had betrayed her. They had never spoken about it directly. Not once. They had remained in contact because their characters made complete silence impossible, but the contact had been formal and careful and had contained, for 40 years, the specific heaviness of a wrong that both of them knew about, and neither of them had found the words to address. The mantel clock, which had been their mother's and which had been in the family house when their father died, had been given to Eleanor as part of the estate settlement. She had kept it. She had known her sister wanted it. She had kept it anyway, partly out of stubbornness, and partly because it was the only tangible object she had that represented the home they had shared as children. And she had not been able to bring herself to give it away, even knowing what her keeping it cost the relationship. She left the clock, along with all relevant documentation supporting the correction of the probate records, to Rebecca. She directed Gerald Foss to ensure that the documentation reached the appropriate legal channels so that the historical record of the estate could be corrected, even 14 years after the fact. She included, in the document case, the deed to the Charlotte property with a notarized letter of conveyance prepared before her death, transferring the property to Rebecca as the surviving representative of her sister's family line. She ended the letter with 2 sentences that Warren read in a voice that had gone quieter than it had been when he started. "I do not ask for forgiveness, because I am not certain forgiveness is mine to ask for. I ask only that you know that your grandmother was right, and that I knew she was right, and that I was a coward for too many years to say so." The reading room was very quiet when Warren finished. The controlled lighting was steady overhead. The 2 archivists sat still at their seats with the respectful stillness of people trained to be present in moments involving old materials and the weight of what they contain. Rebecca was looking at the table. I watched her sit with it, with all of it. The 40 years of silence between 2 sisters, the misunderstood will, the clock that had sat on a mantelpiece somewhere for decades while her grandmother believed it had been taken from her by someone who should have known better. I watched her process it with the same patient thoroughness she brought to a building or a document, not rushing to a conclusion, letting the information settle into its proper arrangement. The morning after the meeting at the Chittenden County Historical Archives, I woke at 4:30 in the morning and lay in my bed on Willard Street listening to the absolute silence of Burlington before dawn and thought about Eleanor Whitfield. Not about the documents. Not about the probate records or the deed to the Charlotte property or the notarized letter of conveyance that Warren had already said he would begin processing through the correct legal channels first thing Monday morning. Not about any of the formal machinery of resolution that had, improbably and after a very long time, finally begun to turn. I thought about the woman herself, Eleanor Whitfield, who had lived somewhere in this same city for most of her life, and who had spent 40 years carrying a wrong she had done and had never found the words to correct while her sister was alive to receive the correction. Eleanor Whitfield, who had sat across a desk from Gerald Foss in the spring of 2010, with her memory beginning to fail and her time running short, and had done with her remaining clarity the thing she had been too proud and too afraid to do for decades. She had made arrangements. She had organized. She had trusted a stranger to carry her intentions forward across the years until they found the person they were meant to reach. I am a retired estate planner. I have spent 31 years thinking about exactly this, about what people do with the things they cannot say while they are alive, about the mechanisms they construct to allow the truth to outlast them, about the gap between what a person intended and what actually happened, and the documents that either bridge that gap or leave it open forever. I have sat with people in their final weeks and watched them organize with tremendous care and with tremendous courage, and I have sat with the families those people left behind and watched them receive, sometimes with gratitude and sometimes with shock and sometimes with a grief that had nothing to do with money or property and everything to do with all the conversations that had never happened while there was still time to have them. Eleanor Whitfield had done something brave. I lay in my bed in the dark, and I held that thought the way you hold a stone that is unexpectedly warm. She had been a coward for 40 years, by her own accounting in the letter she had left behind. And then, at the very end, she had found a specific and practical form of courage. She could not say it herself. She could not look her sister's granddaughter in the eye and say, "I was wrong, and I knew it, and I let it stand anyway because I was too proud to fix it." But she had found a way to say it nonetheless. She had put it in a letter, and she had put the letter in the hands of a professional she trusted, and she had given instructions with enough precision that those instructions survived her death by 14 years and still arrived at their intended destination in reasonably good order. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. If you are sitting with me right now, wherever you are and whatever time it is where you are, I want to stop here for just a moment and invite you to tell me something. Tell me in the comments whether you have ever had to wait a very long time for an explanation that someone owed you. Not an apology necessarily, though sometimes that is part of it. An explanation. A reason. The honest account of why something happened the way it happened, spoken plainly and without evasion. Tell me where you are watching from tonight. What city, what state, what part of the world? Leave a like if this story is settling something in you, even quietly. Subscribe if you want to come back tomorrow, because there is a new story here every single day. This old woman from Burlington, Vermont, has a great many more to tell. Now let me find my place again, because what happened in the weeks after that reading room in Chittenden County is the part of this story I have been building toward all along. Warren filed the preliminary paperwork with the Chittenden County Probate Court on the Monday following our meeting at the archives, just as he had said he would. The correction of a 38-year-old error in a probate record is not a simple matter, Warren had explained to me carefully, as he explains most things carefully, which is what I pay him to do. The original estate of Eleanor and Rebecca's grandfather, whose name was Harold Whitfield and who had died in 1986 at the age of 79, had been settled through the probate court in the ordinary way, with the assets distributed according to the will as it was written and as it had been interpreted at the time. The error in the preparation of the final documents, which had resulted in sole ownership of the Charlotte farmstead being recorded in Eleanor's name rather than joint ownership in both sisters' names, was the kind of clerical error that estate attorneys of a certain era made occasionally, particularly when they were elderly and overworked and handling too many cases at once. The attorney who had prepared the documents had died himself the following year and had taken whatever understanding he had of the error with him. The correction of such an error decades later required, Warren explained, a petition to the probate court, supported by evidence that the error had occurred and by documentation of the intended distribution, as well as a demonstration that the correction could be lawfully made given the subsequent history of the property. Gerald Foss had, it turned out, been preparing for exactly this eventuality for 14 years. The document case he had carried into the Chittenden County Historical Archives contained not only Eleanor's personal correspondence and journals and the sealed letter to Rebecca, but also a memorandum Eleanor had written with his assistance in the spring of 2010, in which she described in her own words her understanding of the original intent of her father's will, her discovery of the error in the final documents, her decision not to correct it at the time, and her wish that the record be corrected posthumously. She had signed the memorandum in front of 2 witnesses and had it notarized. Gerald Foss had kept the original in his document case for 14 years alongside everything else. Warren had looked at that memorandum and then looked at me over the top of his reading glasses with the expression he reserves for moments when he is genuinely impressed by something and is deciding whether to say so. She did her homework, he said. She was running out of time and she knew it, I told him. He nodded once. That tends to focus the mind. I want to talk about Rebecca now, because the story of those documents and that property and that 40-year silence is really, at its heart, Rebecca's story more than it is mine, and I have been telling it from my own perspective because my own perspective is all I honestly have access to. But I want to make sure you understand what this was for her before I go any further. Rebecca Mercer is a woman who has built her professional life on the examination of the past. She spends her working hours studying buildings, documents, the physical record of what people left behind, and she does this work with a precision and a reverence that I have always found admirable, partly because it mirrors the precision and reverence I brought to my own work, and partly because I think it reflects something essential about who she is as a person. She believes that the past is not finished. She believes that what happened before is not simply over, but is actively present in the things people build, and the records people keep, and the stories people tell, and the silence people maintain. She has made a career of paying attention to what persists. And yet her own family's past had contained this gap, this absence, this question that had never been properly answered. The Aldrich farmstead in Charlotte. The mantel clock her grandmother had believed was taken from her. The 40 years of formal, careful contact between two sisters who had loved each other and injured each other and never found their way back to the full truth of what had happened between them. Rebecca had grown up with the weight of that unspoken wrong in her family's history. She had grown up with a grandmother who was reserved about a specific topic in a specific way, with the flatness of tone that belongs to someone who has decided not to feel something fully because feeling it fully leads nowhere useful. She had grown up understanding, in the vague, absorbed way of children and grandchildren, that something between her grandmother and her grandmother's sister had gone wrong and had never been made right. And now, at 52 years old, she was sitting in the reading room of the Chittenden County Historical Archives, holding a letter written by that sister 14 years after her death, addressed to her by name, in which a dead woman had looked back across 40 years and said plainly that her grandmother had been right. She sat with it for a long time after Warren finished reading. The room was quiet, except for the sound of the climate control system and the occasional soft movement of one of the archivists shifting in their chair. None of us spoke. We had all understood, I think, that this was not a moment that needed to be filled with words. When she finally looked up from the letter, she looked at Gerald Foss first. "Did she know," Rebecca asked him, "that my grandmother had already passed away by the time she wrote this?" "She did," he said quietly. "She mentioned it in our initial conversation. She said that was one of the things that made her want to make sure the record was corrected. She could not apologize to your grandmother directly. So she did the next thing she could think of." Rebecca looked at the letter again. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and set it down on the table in front of her with the kind of deliberate gentleness that you give to something fragile and important. "My grandmother asked about that clock every time I saw her," she said. "For 30 years. She always said she could not understand how it had disappeared. She thought she had misremembered where it was supposed to go. She thought perhaps her father had meant to give it to Eleanor all along, and she had simply gotten the story wrong in her own mind." She paused. She spent 30 years doubting her own memory. I looked at my daughter-in-law, and I thought about all the things I had understood over 31 years of working with estates and families, and the complicated mathematics of what people leave behind. I thought about how often the deepest injury in an inheritance dispute is not the monetary loss, but the narrative loss. The story that gets told incorrectly. The person who is made to feel that they misunderstood, that they misremembered, that their account of events was wrong, when in fact their account of events was exactly right, and someone else simply chose to let them go on believing they were mistaken. Rebecca's grandmother had spent 30 years doubting her own accurate recollection of her father's intentions. That was the true cost of what Eleanor Whitfield had chosen not to correct. The investigation into the history of the Charlotte property, which is what I am going to call the next phase of this story, because that is the most accurate description of what it was, took place over roughly 6 weeks in November and early December of last year. And it took place primarily in 3 locations. The Chittenden County Historical Archives, where the archivists were extraordinarily helpful, and where the existing collection of local land records and historical documents turned out to contain materials that were directly relevant to the Whitfield family history. The Chittenden County Courthouse, where Warren and his associate pulled public records with the patience and thoroughness that good legal work requires. And my kitchen table on Willard Street, which is where Rebecca and I sat on many evenings during those weeks with tea or coffee and the copies of documents that Warren had cleared for us to review, working our way through the accumulated record of a family history that was considerably more complicated than any of us had initially understood. What I want to tell you about, before I get to what we found, is what it was like to do that work with Rebecca. Because the work itself was, in its way, a form of the reconciliation that Eleanor Whitfield had been attempting to initiate from the other side of death. Rebecca and I have always had a good relationship. In 26 years of her being my daughter-in-law and the mother of my granddaughter and the wife of my son, we have been consistently respectful and warm with each other, sharing the particular affection of two women who recognize something of themselves in the other and who have chosen, mutually, to be allies rather than adversaries in the complicated ecosystem of a family. But the 6 weeks of the investigation were something different. They were the weeks in which Rebecca told me things about her grandmother and her mother and her family's history that she had never told me before, not because she had been concealing them, but because the occasion to tell them had never arisen in quite the right way. And they were the weeks in which I told her things about my own experience in estate planning that I had rarely articulated outside of professional contexts, the things I had learned about how families carry their wounds, and how those wounds travel across generations, and how the gap between what someone intended and what actually got recorded can quietly shape the lives of people who had no part in creating the gap. We were working, in other words, on the Whitfield family history. But we were also, without either of us having planned it, doing something more personal than that. We were learning each other more fully. The Charlotte farmstead, which is what the Whitfield family had always called the property, was a small piece of land just south of Burlington in the town of Charlotte, which sits on the eastern shore of Lake Champlain in a landscape of agricultural fields and old farm roads, and the kind of views across the water that make you understand why people have been settling in this valley for 4 centuries. The farmstead itself was approximately 12 acres, with a farmhouse that Harold Whitfield had built in 1953 and a small outbuilding and a barn that had been there since well before the Whitfields came. Harold had bought the land in 1949, shortly after he and his wife, whose name was Ruth, returned from the Second World War, Harold having served in the army and Ruth having worked at a munitions plant in Burlington for the duration. They had bought it with savings and a small loan, and they had built the farmhouse with the help of neighbors and family members in the way that people built houses in Vermont in the early 1950s, by showing up for each other on weekends with tools and a willingness to work until dark. Eleanor and her sister, whose name was Dorothy and who was Rebecca's grandmother, had grown up in that farmhouse. They had done their homework at the kitchen table and hung their coats by the back door and learned to drive on the farm roads and left for college in the same decade. Eleanor first and then Dorothy 2 years later, and had each married and built lives that took them in somewhat different directions, while the farmhouse remained the fixed point they returned to for holidays and family occasions. When Harold died in 1986, and Ruth followed him 2 years later, the farmhouse and the 12 acres were, by Harold's expressed intention, meant to pass to both of his daughters jointly. What had actually happened was that the attorney who prepared the final documents had, through what Gerald Foss's review of the available record suggested, was a simple and unremarkable clerical error, produced a deed transferring ownership to Eleanor alone. This was not caught at the time. Dorothy had been grieving and had trusted the legal process to reflect her father's wishes. Eleanor had known the document was wrong and had said nothing. The property had been Eleanor's legally and solely from 1988 until her death in 2010, at which point it had passed, through her own estate, to a charitable organization she had supported for many years, which had held it since without knowledge of the prior dispute. When I say charitable organization, I want you to understand something about the particular texture of what Warren and his associate uncovered when they pulled the records. The organization that held the Charlotte farmstead now was a land trust, a non-profit devoted to the preservation of Vermont farmland and open spaces. They had received the property as a bequest from Eleanor's estate, had assessed it, and had placed a conservation easement on it, which meant that whatever happened to the ownership of the property going forward, it could not be developed. The land would remain farmland. The farmhouse would remain. The barn would remain. This was, Warren pointed out carefully, both a complication and a clarification. A complication because any action to correct the probate record and address the original intent of Harold Whitfield's will now involved not a private individual, but a non-profit organization with its own legal interests in the property. A clarification because the conservation easement meant that the land trust's primary interest was in the land itself and its preservation, not in the commercial or residential development value of the property, which meant that a conversation about the historical record and about Eleanor's final wishes regarding the correction of that record might be received differently than it would have been by a private owner with straightforward financial interests. Warren scheduled a meeting with the Land Trust's executive director for the second week of December. He went with his associate. Rebecca went. I went because Rebecca asked me to, in the same way that Abigail had asked me specifically to come to the campus, and I had learned by now that when the women in this family asked me specifically, the correct response was to clear my calendar. Before I tell you about that meeting, I want to stop for just a moment, because there is something I want to say to anyone who might be watching this right now with their own version of this kind of unresolved family question somewhere in their history. A property that was supposed to be divided differently. A will that did not reflect what you understood the person to have intended. A family asset that disappeared in the gap between someone's death and the settlement of their estate, and never quite came back into the light. If any of that is familiar to you in any way, I want you to know that you are not alone in it, and that the machinery of correction, however slow and however imperfect it is, does exist. Estate attorneys and probate courts, and yes, retired attorneys who have been carrying document cases around for 14 years in the faithful discharge of a dying client's instructions, these things exist. They are not efficient. They are not fast, but they are real. And they have done more work in the world than most people know. Leave me a comment if any part of this story is touching something in your own family history. Tell me where you are watching from, and if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, please do. There is a new story here every single day, and every one of them carries something true. The meeting with the Land Trust's executive director took place on a Tuesday morning in early December in the organization's offices on Pine Street in Burlington. The executive director was a woman in her mid-40s named Caroline Voss, with the particular manner of someone who has spent years navigating complicated conversations about land and money and history and family, and has developed a finely calibrated ability to listen to all sides of a complicated situation without committing to anything until she understands it fully. She listened to Warren's presentation of the legal situation without interrupting. She read the memorandum Eleanor Whitfield had signed in 2010. She looked at the relevant portions of the documentation Gerald Foss had preserved. Then she sat quietly for a moment and looked out the window at the December street. "I want to be clear about what we hold," she said finally. "We hold a conservation easement on the Charlotte property, the farmhouse and the land. We have had it for 14 years. Our interest is in the preservation of the land, not in the building or in the family history of the Whitfields. If the historical record indicates that the original transfer to Eleanor Whitfield was in error, and if the probate court determines that the correction of that error and the application of Eleanor's own stated wishes results in a different disposition of the asset than what we currently hold, we would want to participate in that conversation. But we would not be opposed to a resolution that honors both the preservation of the land and the legitimate inheritance interest of the surviving family." Warren looked at me briefly. It was the look of someone who had prepared for a difficult negotiation and discovered that the other party had come to the table in good faith. What followed over the next several weeks was the kind of legal work that is invisible to everyone who is not doing it or waiting for it to be done, but which is, in its accumulated hours and its careful attention to documents and precedents and procedural requirements, genuinely consequential. Warren filed the petition to correct the probate record with the Chittenden County Probate Court. He submitted the supporting documentation, including Gerald Foss's preserved materials and Eleanor's signed memorandum and the notarized letter of conveyance Eleanor had prepared naming Rebecca as the recipient of her share. The land trust's attorney reviewed the petition and confirmed, after consultation with the board, that the organization would not contest a correction that honored both the historical record and the conservation purposes the easement was designed to serve. A probate judge reviewed the filing and set a hearing date in January. But before the January hearing, something else happened, and it is the part of this story I want to spend time on now, because it is the part that matters most to me personally, and the part that I think will stay with you longest. Abigail came to my house for dinner on a Sunday evening in mid-December, just the two of us. Thomas and Rebecca were visiting friends in Shelburne, and would not be home until late, and Abigail had called me in the early afternoon and asked if she could come over, and I had said of course, and had made the chicken soup with the egg noodles that she had been requesting since she was old enough to make requests. We sat at my kitchen table, which is an old maple table that Richard and I bought at an estate sale in Waterbury the year we moved into this house, and we ate soup and bread and talked about her fellowship and about the documents at the archives and about the photograph of her that had been in Gerald Foss's hands that Tuesday afternoon in October. I had not yet asked her directly about why she had nominated me as her person of contact at the university without telling me. I had thought about asking. I had come very close to asking several times over the preceding weeks. But something had always held me back. The same instinct that had served me well over 31 years of professional work, the understanding that the right question arrives at the right moment, or it does not arrive cleanly at all, and that the ability to wait for the right moment is one of the more useful forms of patience available to a person. That Sunday evening in December, sitting at my maple table with the soup between us and the kitchen smelling of rosemary and bread and the particular warm density of a house that has been lived in for a long time, the moment arrived. "You never asked me," Abigail said. She was looking at her soup bowl, her spoon tracing a small circle in the broth. "Why I asked them to call you, if something happened." "I was waiting for you to tell me," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I knew something was going to happen at the campus. Not the way it happened, not Gerald Foss on the sidewalk with the photograph. I did not know any of that specifically. But I had found something in the archive, a collection of letters that had come in as part of a donation 4 months earlier and had not yet been fully catalogued. And when I started reading them, I understood that they were connected to our family, to Mom's family. And I did not know what to do with that yet. I did not know whether to tell Mom right away or whether to find out more first. And I felt like I needed someone in the family who would know how to handle it if something came to light. Someone who had spent their life knowing how to handle things. She looked up from the bowl. Her dark eyes, which are her father's eyes and which I have loved since the first moment I saw them in that hospital room on a March snowstorm 30 years ago, were calm and direct in the way they become when she is saying something she has thought about carefully. "I chose you," she said, "because you are the person in this family who knows what to do when the past shows up and needs to be dealt with properly." I sat at my maple table in my kitchen on Willard Street in Burlington, Vermont, and I looked at my 30-year-old granddaughter who had inherited, along with her father's eyes and her mother's precision and her grandfather Richard's way of going very still when she was thinking something important. A quality that I recognized from the inside because I had spent a lifetime trying to cultivate it myself. The quality of understanding that the past is not finished, that records matter, that the careful preservation of the truth, even when the truth is complicated and inconvenient and arrives decades late, is work worth doing. "Well," I said, "you chose correctly." She smiled at me across the table, a small, certain smile, and reached for her bread, and we sat in the warm kitchen and ate our soup. The probate court hearing was scheduled for the 19th of January, on a morning that arrived with the specific quality of Vermont winter mornings in deep January, which is to say cold with a thoroughness that is not hostile but simply complete. The kind of cold that has been there so long it has become the default condition of the world and everything else is the exception to it. I drove to the Chittenden County Courthouse on Cherry Street in my old Volvo, which has seen enough Vermont winters to be entirely unbothered by any of them, and I parked in the courthouse lot and sat for a moment in the car, looking at the building. I have been inside that courthouse many times over the course of my professional life. Estate matters, probate filings, the occasional dispute that required a judge's attention rather than a negotiated resolution. I know its hallways and its waiting rooms, and the particular quality of its public spaces, which have the slightly worn institutional warmth of government buildings that have been used by real people conducting real business for a very long time. There is nothing romantic about a courthouse, but there is something I have always found steadying about it, something that has to do with the formality of the proceeding and the seriousness with which the law, at its best, treats the question of what is true and what can be demonstrated and what should rightfully belong to whom. We gathered in a conference room adjacent to the hearing room at 8:30 in the morning. Warren was there with his associate, a meticulous young woman named Patricia, who had done much of the document research over the preceding weeks, and who had an impressive command of Vermont probate law for someone who had been practicing for 7 years. Gerald Foss was there, looking as he always did, quietly resolved, the document case beside his chair as though it were a faithful companion he had been traveling with for a very long time, which was more or less exactly what it was. Rebecca was there, and Abigail had asked to come, and Rebecca had said yes. Thomas came, which was something I had not expected, and which moved me in the way that unexpected demonstrations of commitment from people we love always move us. He had cleared his morning at the bank, arranged for someone to handle his 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock, and driven up from Shelburne in the dark to be present for something that was his wife's inheritance and his daughter's discovery and his mother's professional vindication all at once. Caroline Voss from the Land Trust was there with her own attorney, as Warren had told us she would be. We sat in that conference room for 20 minutes before the hearing while Warren went through the procedural outline one more time with focused brevity, because Warren does not repeat himself beyond the necessary minimum. The petition was straightforward, he said. The supporting documentation was thorough. Eleanor Whitfield's own signed memorandum was the cornerstone, corroborated by the correspondence and journals and by Gerald Foss's professional testimony as the attorney who had received the materials. The Land Trust had filed a statement of non-opposition. The probate judge, whose name was Honorable Ruth Atkins, and who had been on the bench in Chittenden County for 16 years, had reviewed the filing in advance and had indicated through her clerk that the hearing would be relatively brief. Warren paused then and looked around the table. "I want to say something before we go in," he said, which is unusual for Warren, who does not typically editorialize before a hearing. "What you have all assembled here is an unusually complete and unusually well-preserved record. Gerald kept faith with his client's instructions for 14 years. Abigail found the letters in the archive and had the judgment to understand what she had found. Helen brought 31 years of professional experience to bear on a situation that required exactly that. Rebecca has carried something unresolved in her family's history for her entire adult life. And today, that gets corrected." He paused. "This does not always end this way. I want you all to know that. If you are with me right now, I want to pause here for just a moment, because what Warren said in that conference room is something I want to make sure you hear. He was right that it does not always end this way. Most of the time, when someone makes an error in a probate document, and the error is not caught, and the decades pass, and the family carries the wrong in silence, the wrong simply persists. It becomes part of the family story, part of the unspoken weight that people carry in their relationships with each other without quite knowing why. I have seen it too many times to count. The property that should have been divided differently. The inheritance that disappeared into a gap between intention and execution. The 40 years of formal contact between two sisters who loved each other and could not find the way back to the truth. If that rings any bell for any of you watching right now, whether in your own family or in a family you know, I want you to know that there are resources, real ones, that can help you understand what your options are. A probate attorney, a county courthouse, the records that are publicly available. The truth is often there, waiting in documents, if someone takes the time to look carefully enough. Tell me in the comments if this part of the story is landing somewhere specific for you. Tell me where you are watching from. And subscribe, please, because I have more to tell you. And there is a new story here every single day. The hearing before Judge Atkins lasted 40 minutes. She had reviewed the documentation thoroughly in advance, as her clerk had indicated, and her questions were precise and specific, directed at Warren and at Gerald Foss in his capacity as the testifying attorney, about the evidentiary foundation for the petition and the nature of Eleanor Whitfield's stated intent as documented in the signed memorandum. Gerald answered her questions in the careful, unhurried way of a man who has been thinking about this case for 14 years and has very little uncertainty about any detail of it. Warren provided the legal framework with the precision that 33 years of practice in Vermont courts produces. Caroline Voss's attorney confirmed when Judge Atkins asked directly that the Land Trust did not contest the correction of the historical record and was prepared to discuss, in a subsequent proceeding if necessary, the application of Eleanor's stated wishes with respect to the conveyance of her interest in the property. Judge Atkins granted the petition. She did it without ceremony, which is how judges in Vermont probate courts tend to do things, with a quiet, formal acknowledgement of the evidentiary record and a brief statement of the legal basis for the ruling and the signature on the order. But the quiet, formal thing she said before she signed, I remember it exactly, and I want to tell you what it was. She said, "The record in this matter reflects a genuine effort by a deceased person to correct, within the limits of what was possible to her, an error that she allowed to persist for too long during her lifetime. The court finds that effort credible and the documentation supporting it sufficient. The petition is granted. The probate record is corrected to reflect the original testamentary intent of Harold William Whitfield as expressed in his will. Let the record show that the court acknowledges the patience of those who preserved the documentation that made this correction possible. Let the record show that the court acknowledges the patience of those who preserved the documentation." I sat in that hearing room and I thought about Gerald Foss carrying a document case for 14 years. I thought about Abigail finding a collection of uncatalogued letters in a university archive and understanding that they mattered. I thought about Eleanor Whitfield in the spring of 2010, the clarity leaving her slowly and steadily, like light leaving an afternoon, sitting down with a lawyer and doing the most precise and practical thing she could think of with the time she had left. I thought about Rebecca's grandmother, Dorothy, spending 30 years doubting her own accurate memory of her father's wishes, and about the 40 years of formal, careful silence between two women who had been girls together in a farmhouse in Charlotte, and who had each, in their different ways, been carrying the weight of an uncorrected wrong without quite knowing how to put it down. And I thought about what Warren had said in the conference room before the hearing. This does not always end this way. No, it does not. But this time, it did. The weeks that followed the hearing were full of the practical work of resolution, and I will spare you the comprehensive legal detail because Warren and his associate are the appropriate people for comprehensive legal detail, and they handled it with their customary thoroughness. What I will tell you is the shape of how things settled, because the shape matters. The Chittenden County Historical Archives had, through the combined work of Abigail's discovery and the subsequent donations of Eleanor's papers, including the correspondence and journals that Gerald Foss had preserved, received a significant addition to its collection of Vermont family history. Caroline Voss had worked with the archives director to ensure that the Whitfield family materials were properly cataloged and accessible to researchers. The Land Trust had retained the conservation easement on the Charlotte farmstead, which was the outcome they had most cared about, and the farmhouse and land would remain preserved farmland regardless of what happened to the ownership structure. The probate court's order had established the historical record that Harold Whitfield had intended to leave both properties to both daughters, and Eleanor's notarized letter of conveyance had been submitted as part of the corrected estate documentation. Rebecca received title to the Charlotte farmhouse. Not the land itself, which remained under the conservation easement and which the Land Trust retained for preservation purposes. An arrangement that all parties had agreed was the right outcome given the 14-year history of the easement and the organization's genuine commitment to the farmland. But the farmhouse and a modest surrounding parcel, what had been the yard and the kitchen garden and the old stone walk that Harold Whitfield had laid in 1954, came to Rebecca. A small piece of land. A farmhouse built in the year 1953 by a man who came home from the war with savings and a loan and a willingness to work. The place where her grandmother and Eleanor had grown up, where they had learned the world before it became complicated, where they had been sisters in the plain and uncomplicated sense before time and pride and an uncorrected error had introduced all the complications. And the clock. The Aldrich mantel clock had been in Gerald Foss's possession as part of Eleanor's estate for 14 years, along with everything else in the document case. He had kept it carefully, wrapped in archival cloth, inside a wooden box in his office in Montpellier. When he brought it to my house on Willard Street, the weekend after the hearing, unwrapping it from the cloth at my kitchen table with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been waiting a long time to complete a specific task, I looked at it for a long time before I said anything. It was an ornate mantel clock in a walnut case with inlaid details and a brass face, the kind of object that was made in the late 19th century with the specific intention of lasting indefinitely, and which had, in fact, done exactly that. It was not large. It was perhaps 14 inches tall and 12 inches across, the kind of clock that would have sat on a parlor mantel in a Vermont farmhouse without dominating the room, but which would have been the kind of thing you noticed when you came into the room, and which would have become, over years and decades, simply part of what the room felt like. Rebecca was there when Gerald unwrapped it. She stood at my kitchen table and looked at it for a moment without touching it, and then she reached out and rested one hand very gently on the top of the walnut case. "My grandmother used to describe it to me," she said quietly. "I grew up hearing about it. She could tell you exactly what every inlaid piece looked like. She had it all in her memory from the last time she saw it in her father's house." She paused. I think I always believed she was exaggerating a little, the way people do when they talk about things they've lost for a long time. "Was she?" I asked. Rebecca shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "She was completely accurate. I want to stop here and tell you something, if you are still with me on this story." What Rebecca said about her grandmother having every detail exactly right, having held the accurate description in her memory through 30 years of being told implicitly that her account of events was mistaken, through 30 years of the quiet, corrosive doubt that comes from having been wrong once in your own understanding and never quite trusting your own perception of things afterward. That detail is one of the ones I carry with me most from this whole experience, because I have spent 31 years watching what happens when people are made to doubt the accuracy of their own memories about their own histories. It is one of the quieter and more lasting forms of damage that families can do to each other, entirely without intending to, simply by allowing an uncorrected error to persist long enough that the person who knew the truth begins to wonder if they ever really knew it at all. Rebecca's grandmother had known. She had always known. She had simply not been given the confirmation of it while she was alive to receive it. It is an imperfect form of justice, the kind that arrives 38 years late and 14 years after the person who arranged it died. I am not going to pretend to you that I do not feel the imperfection of it. I am an estate planner by training and temperament, and the imperfection of it bothers me in the specific way that a document with an error bothers me, with a persistent, low-level awareness that the correction, however necessary and however well executed, cannot fully undo the cost of the original error. Dorothy never got her father's clock in her father's lifetime. She never got Eleanor's acknowledgement while Eleanor was alive to give it. She spent 30 years doubting her own accurate memory. But here is the other thing I know. After 76 years of being alive and 31 years of sitting across tables from people navigating the aftermath of loss and the weight of what gets left behind, imperfect justice is still justice, 14 years late is still arrived. A correction made in the probate records of Chittenden County in January of this year cannot undo 38 years of error, but it is the accurate historical record now, and it will remain the accurate historical record for as long as records are kept. Abigail found Eleanor's letters in an uncatalogued archive. Gerald Foss kept faith with his client's instructions for 14 years in a document case that went everywhere he went. Eleanor Whitfield sat down in the spring of 2010 with the clarity leaving her and did the most precise and practical thing she could think of with what she had left. Imperfect, incomplete, and real. There is one more thing I have not yet told you, and it is the thing I want to make sure I tell you before I bring this story toward its end. It has to do with Abigail, and with why I think she is the most important person in this whole account, not because she found the letters, though that matters, and not because she had the judgment to understand what she had found, though that matters too, but because of a conversation she had with Rebecca in the weeks after the hearing, which Rebecca told me about one afternoon in February when we were driving back from Charlotte together, having been to the farmhouse for the first time. I will tell you about that afternoon in Charlotte shortly. But first, let me tell you what Rebecca told me Abigail had said to her. Abigail had told her mother that when she first found Eleanor's letters in the uncatalogued collection at the archive, she had understood almost immediately that they were connected to her mother's family. She had recognized the Whitfield name from stories she had heard growing up, and she had understood from the content of the letters that they pertained to a family dispute involving property. She had spent 3 days reading through the letters carefully before she told anyone. And during those 3 days, she had made a decision that she then explained to Rebecca with the particular directness that Abigail brings to everything she says. She had decided not to handle it herself, not because she did not know how, but because she understood that handling it herself would have meant making a series of decisions about her mother's family history without her mother's knowledge or consent, and that even if her intentions were entirely good, the act of managing her mother's inheritance for her, of deciding what her mother should know and when and how, would have been a form of the same error that had caused all of this in the first place. The error of making decisions for other people about things that belong to them without consulting them. Of substituting your own judgment, however careful and however well-intentioned, for the consent of the person who actually has the right to decide. So she had gone to me instead. She had told me, not everything, because she had not yet fully understood everything herself, but enough. She had set things in motion in a way that would allow her mother to be present for the discovery rather than being presented with the conclusions of a discovery someone else had already made. She was 30 years old, and she had understood something about inheritance and family and the ethics of handling other people's histories that many people spend a lifetime not quite arriving at. She had understood it clearly enough to act on it, clearly enough to ask for help rather than proceed alone, clearly enough to trust that the people around her were capable of handling what needed to be handled if given the chance. I drove home from Charlotte that afternoon in February through the gray Vermont landscape with the bare fields on either side of the road and the lake somewhere beyond the tree line to the west, and I thought about all of it. The whole shape of it, from Abigail's phone call in October, to the hearing room in January, to the afternoon in the farmhouse in Charlotte. And I thought about what it means to leave something behind for the people who come after you. Not just property, not just legal documents, but understanding, the accurate record of what happened and why, the honest acknowledgement of where things went wrong, the arrangement made carefully and at real personal cost for the truth to survive you. On a Saturday morning in late February, Rebecca and I drove down to Charlotte together to open the farmhouse. It had been unoccupied for 14 years. The land trust had maintained the exterior and the roof and the essential systems because a deteriorating farmhouse is not consistent with their conservation mission, and the building was structurally sound. But it had not been lived in since Eleanor Whitfield died in the autumn of 2010. And the interior had the specific quality of rooms that have been closed and cold for a long time, a stillness that is different from the ordinary stillness of an empty house, something more like the stillness of a place that has been waiting. We parked on the farm road and walked up the stone path that Harold Whitfield had laid in 1954. The same stone path that had been in the photographs in Eleanor's journals. The same path Rebecca's grandmother had walked on every visit to the family home, until the distance between her and her sister made those visits too painful to continue. The farmhouse was a white clapboard building with green shutters, 2 stories, the kind of proportions that Vermont farmhouses from that era tend to have, sensible and solid and built without any wasted space. The old maple tree in the yard was enormous, several feet in circumference, its bare branches against the February sky making the same complicated lacework I had seen in the elms on Colchester Avenue in October. Rebecca had the key from the land trust. She stood at the front door for a moment before she put it in the lock, and I stood beside her and did not say anything because this was her moment and there was nothing I needed to add to it. She unlocked the door and we went inside. The interior smelled of cold and old wood, and the closed quality of a space that has been sealed for a long time. The light came through the windows with the flat, clear quality of February light in Vermont, which illuminates without warming. The rooms were as empty as you would expect from a house that had been closed for 14 years, the furniture that had been there in Eleanor's time long since dispersed. But the bones of the house were all there, the layout of the rooms, the proportions of the ceilings, the wide floorboards of pine that Harold Whitfield had put down in 1953, the stone fireplace in the living room that was built from Lake Champlain limestone. Rebecca walked through the rooms slowly. I followed at a slight distance, because this was her grandmother's childhood home, and her great-aunt's final home, and her own inheritance. And all of those things together warranted a kind of private attention that I wanted to allow her to have. She stopped in the living room by the fireplace and looked at the mantelpiece. It was the same mantelpiece that was visible in the background of the photograph Gerald Foss had been holding on the sidewalk in October. The same wooden mantelpiece on which the Aldrich clock had sat through the years of Eleanor's occupancy, and before that, through the years of her parents' occupancy, and before that, presumably, through the years of whoever lived here before the Whitfields. The mantelpiece was empty now, of course, but Rebecca stood in front of it for a long moment with her hand resting on the wood, and I watched her, and I understood something about what this room contained that had nothing to do with the legal record and everything to do with the accumulated presence of lives lived in a place. The rooms a family inhabits over generations hold something of the family in them, not in any mystical sense, but in the real, physical sense that a worn threshold and a painted wall and a stone fireplace bear the marks of the hands and the feet and the lives that shaped them over time. I want to stop here for just a moment, because this story is coming toward its end, and before it does, I want to say something to whoever is sitting with me right now. If you are someone who has been carrying an unresolved question about your own family's history, whether it involves property or inheritance, or simply the explanation of why something happened the way it did, and whether the story you were always told was the accurate one, I want to tell you something I believe with the specificity of someone who has spent 31 years working in this particular area of the law. The records that pertain to your family's history are more often available than people think. Probate records in the United States are generally public documents, filed in the county courthouse of the county where the estate was administered. Land records are typically maintained at the county level as well, and in many counties they are now digitized and searchable. An attorney who specializes in estate and probate law can tell you what is recoverable and what the realistic options are for addressing errors or omissions in the historical record, and that initial consultation is often less expensive than people expect. But more than the legal mechanics, what I want to say to you is this: the instinct to know. The conviction that the story you were told and the story that actually happened are not quite the same. The feeling that something in your family's history is unresolved in a way that continues to shape the present even though it happened a long time ago. That instinct is worth taking seriously. It is not imagination. It is not the projection of an overactive mind. It is often, in my experience, exactly correct. People carry the weight of unresolved family history in their bodies and their relationships and their sense of who they are. And the resolution of it, even when it arrives late, and even when it is imperfect, even when it cannot undo the cost of the original error, produces something real, something that changes the quality of the air in the room, something that Rebecca's grandmother would have recognized instantly had she been alive to feel it. The confirmation that she had been right. The behavioral changes that Eleanor's self-imposed silence produced in that family over 40 years are not different in their fundamental nature from the kinds of changes I see whenever a family carries an unacknowledged wrong across time. People become more formal with each other than they need to be. Small celebrations become exercises in careful emotional management. The subject that cannot be discussed shapes every conversation that happens around it. The object that is absent from the mantelpiece is more present in some ways than it would have been if it had simply been there. Children and grandchildren absorb the weight of what they have not been told, carry it without understanding what it is, and eventually it becomes part of their understanding of how families work, of what is safe to say and what is not, of whether honesty or dignity is the more reliable guide. Eleanor's choice to let an error stand for 40 years was not a dramatic or violent choice. It was a quiet one. And quiet choices made over decades produce changes in families that are quieter than crises, but often more lasting. If you know a family, your own or someone else's, where this kind of quiet, persistent unresolution is present, tell me about it in the comments below. Not the specifics, you do not owe me those. But tell me if any part of this story has touched something you recognize. Tell me where you are watching from. And please, if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, do it now. There is a new story here every single day. And every one of them carries something true at its center, something from real life and real experience and the real complexity of what families do with what they leave behind. Every story is different, but they all have this much in common. They are about what it costs to let the truth wait, and what it means when it finally arrives. The Aldrich mantel clock is in the Charlotte farmhouse now. Rebecca placed it on the mantelpiece herself on that Saturday morning in February, and the two of us stood in the cold living room of a farmhouse built by her grandfather in 1953 and looked at it for a moment in the February light. It looked exactly right on that mantelpiece. It looked, as Rebecca said quietly, like it had always been there, which in a very real sense was precisely true. The clock had always belonged on that mantelpiece, in that room, in that house. It had simply taken a long time to find its way back. The clock is a good timekeeper. Gerald Foss had wound it periodically over the 14 years he had cared for it, keeping the mechanism in working order, because that was the kind of attention to detail that Gerald brought to everything in his care. Rebecca wound it that morning and set the time, and when the mechanism engaged and the clock began to tick, the sound it made in the cold, still room was the sound of something restored to its proper function. I thought about Harold Whitfield, who built that house in 1953 and who stood in that room when the fireplace was new and the floorboards were unworn, and who probably did not imagine that the clock on the mantelpiece would still be ticking 7 decades later. I thought about Ruth, who made a home in those rooms and raised 2 daughters in them and kept the particular daily rhythms of a farmhouse life through the post-war years and into the decades beyond. I thought about Eleanor and Dorothy as girls in that house, doing their homework at the kitchen table and learning the world within the specific compass of 12 acres and a stone path and a mantelpiece with a clock on it that measured out their childhood. I thought about the 40 years of distance that had opened between those 2 girls after their father died, and about the letter Eleanor had written to Dorothy's granddaughter in the spring of 2010, and about Gerald Foss sitting alone in his office in Montpellier with a document case beside his desk for 14 years, keeping faith with a client's instruction because that was what he had promised to do. I thought about Abigail finding letters in an uncatalogued collection in a university archive and understanding that they mattered, and making the wise and careful choice to bring in someone who knew what to do rather than handling it alone. I thought about my 31 years of sitting across tables from people navigating the aftermath of loss, and about the specific afternoon when a retired attorney stood on a sidewalk on Colchester Avenue, holding a photograph that I had not yet understood, but that had turned out to contain, in its barely visible background detail, the first visible evidence of an inheritance waiting to be claimed. I thought about what Warren had said in the conference room before the hearing. This does not always end this way. No, it does not. But sometimes, when the documentation is preserved with care and the faith is kept, and the right person finds the right letter in an uncatalogued archive in the autumn, when a retired attorney carries a document case for 14 years because he made a promise, and a promise is something he takes seriously, when a 30-year-old woman has the wisdom to ask for help rather than proceeding alone, and when a 76-year-old retired estate planner still has enough of her professional precision left to understand what she is looking at when she sees it. Sometimes, imperfectly, and very late, and with the accumulated cost of every year of the delay written into the faces of the people in the room, sometimes it ends this way. The clock ticked in the cold room. Rebecca stood at the window and looked out at the farm road and the bare maple tree and the flat gray February sky over Charlotte, Vermont. And I stood beside her, and neither of us said anything for a while, because sometimes what has just happened is large enough that the kindest thing language can do for it is stay out of the way and let it be. Then she said, "I'm going to fix this place up. I want Thomas and Abigail involved. I want us all to know this house." "I think that is exactly right," I told her. She turned from the window and looked at me with the steady, clear regard that she has brought to everything she does for the 26 years I have known her. "Helen," she said, "thank you for knowing what to do." I thought of Abigail saying the same thing to me across a kitchen table with soup between us in December. I thought of Eleanor Whitfield choosing the most practical and precise form of courage available to her at the end of her clarity. I thought of 31 years of sitting with the complicated mathematics of what people leave behind, and who it reaches, and whether it arrives the way it was meant to. "Someone always has to," I said. "If you stayed with me through all of it, through the October sidewalk and the reading room and the farmhouse in February and everything in between, I want you to know that it means a great deal to me. This is my family's story, and I do not tell it lightly. But I tell it because I believe that the things this story is about are things that matter to more people than just us. The way unresolved family history accumulates weight across time. The way documentation, patient and precise, and sometimes carried around for 14 years in a document case, makes the correction of the past possible. The way the instinct to know the truth, even when the truth is complicated and arrives late, is worth taking seriously. The way the people we trust with our most important tasks sometimes keep that trust in ways we never get to see, working quietly in the background of the years until the moment when what they have been keeping is needed. Leave me a comment with the word "returned." Only the people who truly stayed with this story will understand why that word is right. Tell me where you are watching from, what city, what state, what country. I read every single one. Tell me what time it is there. If this story reached something in you, leave a like. It is the simplest and most generous thing you can do for someone who has shared something true. Subscribe if you want to come back tomorrow, because there is a new story here every single day without fail, and every one of them carries something real at its center. Share this one with someone you think might need to hear it, because the right story has a way of finding the right ears when it is sent in the right direction. From my kitchen table on Willard Street in Burlington, Vermont, with the maple tree outside the window that Richard planted the year our son started school, to wherever you are right now in the world. Thank you for listening. Take good care of each other, and take good care of what you have been trusted to carry.